Welcome to the Election Protection Podcast, where we talk all things election integrity. This is Josh Findlay, and we are joined today by Congressman Brandon Gill. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about the SAVE Act. A lot has been happening with this in Congress. It has two primary functions that we're going to discuss today: only citizens voting in federal elections, and also a voter ID requirement. So Congressman, thanks for joining us from just north of Dallas, Fort Worth, right?
Yep, that's exactly right. Good old Denton County.
Okay. Before we dive into the interesting stuff here for our audience, tell us a little bit about yourself. You've got a lot of interesting things happening in Congress right now.
Yeah, we've got a lot going on right now. So I represent Texas 26, which is the area just north of the DFW Metroplex. It rapidly grown, one of the fastest growing portions of the country. But grew up in West Texas on a cattle ranch, went to college in the Northeast where I met my wife. We've been married for over 8 years now, have two young kids, a 2.5-year-old and a 10-month-old little baby who are here in D.C. with us for a little bit. Worked in finance and media for several years before jumping into elected office, and have been here for about the past year or so. And we've just been doing everything we can to fight to take our country back, to get our country back on track, and to keep up with the president, because he's been doing phenomenal work. But here in D.C., I serve on the House Judiciary, Budget, and Oversight committees, where we work on everything from immigration, which has been a big focus of mine, to election integrity, which is the focus here. And I think the most important thing we have in front of us right now.
Well, we certainly think so on this podcast. But then also, you're freshman class president, right?
Right.
Tell our listeners what that means. We've never had one of those on this podcast before.
Yeah, so whenever you first get elected, your class, based on political party, elects class leadership, and one of those is the freshman class president. So what my job has been is to help everybody sort of get up started whenever we first come in, get up to speed, and then we host social events. We do things to kind of keep the class together. So it's been a lot of fun.
That's pretty cool. We love it. So the House, when it comes to the Save America Act,
Yeah.
they've already passed this bill twice under the Save Act's title,
Right.
once under the Save America Act's title, and just this week it's come before the Senate.
Yeah.
The Senate just voted to open this up for debate. Tell us a little bit procedurally what this means and what we think the odds are of an outcome at this point.
Yeah, it's tough to handicap what the odds are of success, but they're looking better and better every day in a lot of ways. So if you think about, and this is, I'm of course in the House, this is the Senate side, but the way the Senate works is you have to boil it down, you have two different stages to get a bill out of the Senate. First is you have the debate stage, and then you have the voting stage where you actually vote on the underlying bill. And it's during the debate stage that you have that 60 vote threshold that we typically associate with what's needed to get a bill out of the Senate. And during that debate stage, the way it should work, I think, is that senators come in and they debate. They actually go to the floor and discuss the merits of any bill, and they can introduce amendments, and they can debate amendments, and they can vote them up or down or whatever to make a bill better. They can deliberate. Now, there are two ways to end debate in the Senate so that you can then move to the second stage, which is voting on the underlying bill. And that second stage, by the way, requires only a 50 vote threshold. So there are two ways that you can end debate. One of them is that you can just run out the clock, essentially, that everybody in the Senate debates this, and each senator gets two different chances to talk, essentially. And once everybody has talked as long as they're allowed to, then if you move on to actually voting on the bill, that's one way to end debate. The second way is for a cloture vote, meaning you don't have to debate at all, but if you can get 60 senators to vote to end debate via this cloture vote, then you can move on to vote on the underlying bill. What's happened over time is that the Senate has morphed into not actually debating anything physically, not discussing anything, but just relying on threats to debate, threats to filibuster. In effect, they've used that 60 vote threshold as kind of like the de facto sort of rule. Whereas the rule actually, as it's written now, allows you either one of those two measures. So what we've been saying in the Senate is that we should use the talking filibuster. It doesn't require a change in the rules there. It just requires senators to actually debate the merits of the bill. So you think about it this way, is that the Senate the Senate is like the American version of the House of Lords, right there. We in the House are, we're the ones who are supposed to be closer to the people. We're, as you can tell, probably a bit more of a rowdy bunch than they are in the Senate.
That's right.
But the Senate is supposed to be the deliberative body, and they pride themselves on being the deliberative body. And I think that if you want to be the deliberative body, then you ought to actually deliberate legislation. And that's what we're saying for the Save America Act here, is run out the clock on debate and then vote on the underlying bill. And doing so would require only a 50+1 vote threshold rather than that 60.
That is a perfect explanation. Thank you for that. It has been covered pretty widely in the news so far that the Republicans don't have the 60 votes to get to cloture, right? Which means that we have to rely kind of on that first mechanism there, right there, to run out debate. What can people who are watching in the Senate expect to see on the floor over the next couple of days?
Yeah, and that's the interesting part here. So what Senator Thune has done was he's opened up debate. And he's put in, there's an amendment tree. And those are the amendments that you can vote on, that the senators will deliberate and vote on during this voting deliberative process. He has done what's called filling the tree. So he's put a whole bunch of Republican amendments up for the senators to deliberate on and vote on. And the purpose of that, which is not a talking filibuster, but it is almost like one step before a talking filibuster, you might say, or something that could morph into potentially a talking filibuster. And what he's doing there is getting the senators to actually talk about this, which they're not used to doing, by the way, to actually talk about this legislation, talk about the amendments that senators are bringing, and also gets them, I think, in a way, sort of bought into this process. It's kind of like, we're going to do this for at least a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe longer. So you're sort of emotionally and physically, you actually have to be around the Senate floor. They're actually voting on amendments, or they're focused on this in a way that they wouldn't otherwise be. So the hope is that eventually morphs into, because I'm skeptical you're going to get the 60 votes to reach cloture, because I don't think we're to the point yet where Democrats are going to come over, but we are sort of tiring them out right now. So I'm hoping what happens is either we just keep tiring them out until you do reach that 60 vote threshold where enough Democrats say, I'm sick of talking about this. I'm sick of talking about all these Republican amendments. I'll just vote for cloture because I'm done with this. Or if you go to a cloture vote and it fails, you just morph this into a talking filibuster and you say, okay, we're going to use one legislative day, which can last a very long time and in the real time. And we're going to debate this, and then we're going to end debate because everybody's been talked out, and we're going to vote on the underlying bill. So I hope that makes sense. That is how the deck is potentially morph into a talking filibuster. It's tough to see where it goes. It changes every day. And part of the reason is that this is kind of a new set of, it's not a new process, but this hasn't been done in quite some time in the Senate. So it's new to the people who are there.
I was going to say, I've been told that probably none of the sitting senators have been through this process at this point.
Right. So it's a, it's a muscle that hasn't been exercised or worked by these senators. But I think that they feel the pressure from our voters and our base, rightfully, that this is a must-pass piece of legislation. And we've been talking a lot about procedurally how this works, but I think once you get out of Washington, most voters, they just say, this is a common sense piece of legislation. 85% of the country agrees with it. Republican and Democrat want it. So why can't you get it done? In other words, they don't care about the arcane Senate procedural rules or whether this is a change in rules versus a change in precedent. Nobody cares outside of Washington. They just want the bill done.
I think that is very true. So then let me ask you, what are the reasons that senators, both Republican and Democrat, because it's not just Democrats that are opposing this, what are they giving for not supporting this, even though, like you said, 85% of Americans across the board believe that this is good policy?
Yeah, I think the rationale for the underlying bill is different. For the actual merits of the SAVE Act, I think we've got almost every Republican in the Senate who disagrees. There may be one or two who agrees. On the Democrat side, even though their voters support the bill, Democrat senators largely don't. And I think that's a function of Democrats knowing that they can and have been weaponizing mass migration for political gain. It wasn't just 4 years under Joe Biden where they flooded the country with illegal aliens. But I mean, we had a border crisis 20 years ago, 25 years ago in the United States. And Democrats have been talking for a long time about how demographics is destiny, about how mass migration will change the fabric of the United States to politically benefit them at the expense of Republicans. I mean, that's from Democrat academic circles. That's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. So I think that once they see that knowing that that's been their plan, they're not going to do anything to walk away from that. And they know that, between a massive illegal alien population in the United States and unsecure elections, even in the short term, they can benefit politically. I mean, this is essentially a way to cheat and to rig our elections in their favor is the best way to summarize it. They're making a deal that if they can create a system where illegal aliens can vote, those illegal aliens are going to vote Democrat.
Well, I think that is something that we've talked about a lot on this podcast. So then let me follow up with this. A lot of people are saying, well, I guess let me phrase it this way. Then if the SAVE Act doesn't pass, because it sounds like we're kind of up in the air still procedurally about whether it will or not.
Yeah.
What can we expect to see in terms of voter ID and citizenship voting across the country if it doesn't pass?
Yeah, that, I'll say a couple things. One is I want to keep our eyes on the prize, and let's do everything we can for this to pass, because I think the Senate needs to know that the American people are demanding it. And honestly, we're going to have a hard time in November if we don't get this passed, especially in the House, because I think that voters are not going to forget this, and they're not going to be sympathetic to us for not getting it done. However, if we don't, there's a couple different things we can do. One of them, Senator Fetterman has recently floated an idea of a sort of a boiled down Save America Act, which doesn't check for citizenship, but does require voter ID. Maybe that's a potential alternative. I don't even want to really think about things like that right now. I don't think that doesn't solve the problem. And I think that we need to be forcing the Save America Act. But, I think, you may have people talk about that. There's some talk about trying to get the Save America Act as it's currently written as part of reconciliation, which is the process procedurally that we used to pass the tax bill that we did last year. Candidly, I think that would be a difficult route to go down. There are lots of legal stipulations as to what can and can't go in a reconciliation bill. And I don't think most of the Save America Act can, at least as it's written. There may be ways to change it. But I don't buy that. So I don't think that that's the route to go down. And at that point, our chances are running pretty thin. I mean, the reality is, if you want the Save America Act to get signed into law, and that's the goal for this, we're not looking for showboats. We're not looking to put Democrats on record or do any of that nonsense. They're already on record. Like, they talk all the time about how they're opposed to the Save America Act. So all that kind of kabuki theater nonsense, nobody cares about that. We want the bill signed into law. And if you want it signed into law, the best way to do that, the most sure way, is a talking filibuster.
Yeah. So it's interesting. A lot of people oppose voter ID on policy, right? In non-citizen voting, they always say it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote. But what we're seeing coming out in the news are cases like in Kansas, where people are they're finding out that non-citizens are voting up to 7 times. Yeah. People are getting charged for non-citizen voting. In Minnesota, you see like the lack of voter ID laws, and just in a culture of fraud, how it's affected potentially elections up there. What would you say to people that the underlying concerns in getting this passed are not real? That this is a law in search of a resolution to a problem that doesn't exist? What would you say to people that are arguing that?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. First of all is that in a lot of blue states, all you have to do is basically check a box saying that you're an American citizen, and then you're allowed to vote. You don't have to show any kind of documentation, ID, nothing. You don't have to show that, oftentimes whenever you're registering to vote. That's a problem. In a country where Democrats, via mass migration and other horrendous policy ideas, have completely eroded social trust, especially in many of our major cities, that system doesn't work anymore. And you see that on a practical level. We took off thousands of people, illegal aliens, off the voter rolls in Texas just recently. You have multiple instances of illegal aliens, to your point, voting in our election. So it does happen. And that's just looking backwards. Looking forwards, after 20 million people walked across our border illegally, you can only expect that to happen more in the United States. Particularly if whenever we're in power, we allow it to happen. Whenever we're in power, we don't pass voter ID laws. I think that almost gives, Republican approbation to unsecure elections.
And I think that's a really important distinction to make, because people are talking about how maybe there's not a big problem, but we should pass this to give people confidence in the process and the results. But there actually is an underlying problem there, right? Just because it's not being prosecuted at every instance or things like that doesn't mean a problem doesn't exist.
I mean, do you really expect blue jurisdictions that harbor illegal aliens as a matter of policy, by the way, sanctuary cities and states, to be going after voter fraud? Of course not. They could care less. I mean, that is part of their political program.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's interesting that the cities that have an incentive to not look for this are not looking for it. And I think that's skewing statistics on how widespread non-citizen voting or unverified voting could be.
Right. Oh, of course. And, to the extent that Democrats are trying to argue that, we don't need this law because they're not voting in our elections or they're not allowed to vote or whatever. If that's truly the case, why are they so opposed to it? And they'll claim it's because it disenfranchises Americans, which none of that is true. There are multiple ways per the text of this law that you can prove that you're an American citizen. States have an off-ramp where they can create a system where, if somebody changed their ID or, recently got married, where they can, somebody else can vouch for them, all kinds of ways to do that. In fact, maybe we should tighten it up a little bit in this bill. So there are there is no legitimate argument that the left has against this other than that they just want unsecure elections.
And I think it's really interesting. If, speaking to the underlying issue, if this problem were solved tomorrow, right, and we tightened this up on non-citizen voting and voter ID, practically, what would that look like for our elections? If this does get passed, what can we expect in 2026, but also for the election culture going forward?
Yeah, on a practical level, if you're already registered to vote, things don't change a whole lot. You've already got your voter registration. You show up to the polls, show them an ID, and you vote just like you would at any other instance. But what I think it does is it proves to the American people that we don't have people who shouldn't be voting in our elections, illegal aliens, non-citizens voting. So whenever you have sanctuary jurisdictions, you're probably going to have fewer, ballot harvesting from Democrats going onto the streets, taking ballots from illegal aliens or people who shouldn't be here. I mean, I think you're going to see a whole lot less of this kind of election shenanigans. But for your average person, practically speaking, not much changes.
And I think that's such an important distinction to make. For your average voter, there's not going to be a big effect. Right. If you are in the country legally, you're a proper voter in a jurisdiction, you're not going to have a big difference. Now, the difference will come for people that are not citizens, that are trying to vote in these elections, that don't have proper documentation, that are trying to do it.
That's 100%.
Yep. Perfect. Congressman Gill, you've been incredibly generous with your time during this very busy moment in Congress. Final thoughts.
Yeah.
What do you want to see from the American people to influence the Save America Act, to get it across the finish line? And what do you hope people will take away from this debate going forward?
Yeah, I hope the American people realize that we've made a lot of progress in the Senate. Again, nothing is done until this gets signed into law, but they have made quite a bit of progress. And I'd give a ton of credit to Mike Lee over in the Senate, who's been taking the slings and arrows for weeks, pushing this aggressively. But the best thing that the American people can do is do not let up right now. Now is the time to put the pedal to the floor. Make sure the Senate knows we not only want this, we absolutely demand this get signed into law. So call Senate offices. Make sure that they know what you want. Speak out on social media everywhere you can to keep this at the top of the news cycle until it gets done. That's the biggest thing. What I've been saying in the House is I don't think that the House of Representatives should take up any Senate bills until the Senate gets Save America signed into law. Said earlier this week that I wasn't going to vote. I told House leadership privately, publicly, within our conference that I wasn't going to vote for any Senate bill until this gets done in the Senate. I didn't this week whenever we had one sent over to us. So I think anything you can do to show the Senate that this is serious to you, we ought to be doing.
Well, that's wonderful. Congressman, you're on the right side of this issue. Where can people go to find out more about what you're working on and express their support for what your office is doing?
We're all over social media. We're on X, on Facebook, on Instagram. I'm at Rep Brandon Gill. You can find us online. We've got our website where you can learn more about what we're doing as well.
Perfect. Congressman Gill, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
This is Josh Findlay with the Election Protection Podcast. You can follow me on @RealJoshFindlay on X and research the Texas Public Policy Foundation on YouTube. You can find video broadcasts of all of our podcasts. Thanks for joining us.